Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. If you're not familiar with the program and just happen to be turning it on coincidentally, this is 1 hour of news of political assassinations and investigations of government conspiracies. If you want to get a bibliography for the source of material for this broadcast or any other broadcast you've heard before or in the future, write to me, Mae, M-A-E, Brussels, like Brussels sprouts, Brussell, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93923. As the hour develops, I escalate the speed because there's so much I want to get on the program, so I'll give you that information now, and we'll have that behind us. This is broadcast number 718, September the 9th, 1985. Before I get into the bulk of the material this evening, I want to share the name of another researcher who has material available for you, printed material mostly, and some cassettes, similar to David Emery's research up north. His name is John Judge, and we've been friends for about 14 years. We share information, as I do with other people, but he particularly has a lot of material he'll share with you. And write to him, send a self-addressed stamped envelope, P.O. Box 6586, and then capital letter T, Washington, D.C., 20009. He has an essay, an article that he wrote on the connection of the Russian Revolution and the fascist network that formed in Europe, Western Europe then, to the Cold War, to the CIA and the Kennedy assassination. He charges $3, but I won't give you the price of all this. Just send for the mailing list to that address, and if I said it too fast, you can telephone or write to me for it. He has articles on, he's copied articles that were written by other people. One from Springfield magazine on Otto Skorzeny at Dachau prison, and that has to do with the relationship to Klaus Barbie. He has some tape cassettes on the assassinations. He's reprinted Mysterious Deaths and the Kennedy Assassination that came out, Penn Jones wrote for The Rebel. And my articles he has reprinted. He makes them available for you, the Korean airline and the Nazi connections to the Kennedy assassination. In addition to being knowledgeable to all of those things, he's particularly knowledgeable onto the Jonestown genocide, mind control, CIA operations, and he has a lot of literature on Jonestown, the CIA, another report on the Jonestown banks, and Jimmy Jones from the Aquasani notes, and psychiatry, Nazi psychiatry, as taken from Germany and then into the United States. He reprints Lenny Lappin's article on the psychiatric final solution and so forth. He covers a wide range of material having to do with political assassinations, mind control, and genocide, racist genocide. So write John Judge. He's the judge. Judgege. That's the way it goes. P.O. Box 6586, capital letter T, Washington, D.C., 20009. A lot of you new listeners or old listeners or some that have been listening to World Watchers on and off or intermittently sometimes wonder if Mae Brussell is carrying such a burden alone and give the impression that I'm the only one doing some of these things, and I'm only one you hear because you're not in the range of these other people. But there are, in fact, very fine, dedicated investigators, the series that Nip Tuck and David Emery are doing up north. I gave you that address. And I'll repeat it on the air from time to time, or you can call me and develop your own library and your own printed fact sheets on these various interlocking relationships, because I get a lot of material from them. I'm not the one who finds it all. I learn from them, and they learn from me. So write to John Judge and take care of that. Now, Los Angeles Herald had an update on the Joseph Mengele story, which I will be doing continuously with you, because I don't think Mengele is dead. This is September the 4th, 1985, L.A. Herald. United States requests another look at the Mengele Skull. São Paulo, Brazil. The U.S. Justice Department has asked for further microscopic examinations of a skull identified as being Joseph Mengele. They wrote to São Paulo Federal Police. They are asking for further examinations, and out of São Paulo, Romeo Tuma, police chief, who was part of the death squads and the terror squads in the dictatorship years, which haven't really ended in Brazil yet. He said this no way represents any doubt to the identification of the remains. They're definitely Mengele, but the people that did the identification, one of them, Mr. Dr. Hameli, said, please save the skull, and if anything changes, if you find anything that changes this story, then I'll change my mind. And he said, as of this date, this is Mengele. But he said, for goodness sakes, don't get rid of the skull. Now, they may take the skull and photograph it and make other x-rays that positively identify to what they have of another head they're calling Mengele. But at this point, they want another look at the skull. Now, there's a small newspaper. It's sort of like the Examiner or the Star, I suppose, a national newspaper called The Sun. And a subscriber to World Watchers sent me the copy, September the 3rd, 1985, that you might have seen. And it's titled, Nazis in Brazil Plot to Destroy America. Now, I've done 21 years of research, and I've read the books of the Nazis early in the 20s and 30s and 40s on how they would take America, and even speeches of Adolf Hitler on how he would take America. But I yet don't know that people are writing, I don't see it, that we are a conquered nation, or take that hypothesis that I have, that we are in fact taken over and that the Nazis want to conquer us, to destroy us, which is why I think we're having so many problems today and in the past, and I've expressed those week after week. This article sounds like the outline of a Mae Brussell description of World Watchers. This is the way it goes. A secret Nazi organization has laid master plans to destroy the United States as a 100th birthday present for Adolf Hitler. I may correct and interject like I do when I read many of these stories. It's not so secret. I have about 1,000 books on the Nazis, and I'd have 3,000 if I could afford them. And the Odessa organization that they're talking about is throughout the books, and why people have been so placid until now or until tomorrow or as it happens, I really don't understand. But it's not a secret organization. It's a very well-known organization headed by the late Otto Skorzeny, who worked for the CIA and was under Henry Kissinger after the war. The article goes on, the conspiracy includes mass assassinations. Yes, we're having those. The mass assassinations of public officials, bombing major buildings and factories. Yes, we're getting our fires and bombs. And hostage-taking on an unprecedented scale. This is what the top intelligence sources have agreed. Now, I believe that this last TWA and even the Iranian hostage crisis, as I put it together, were manufactured and created for political purposes, and they will increase. The article goes on, the organization known as the Odessa is determined to make 1989, the centenary of Hitler's birth, a celebration of horror, according to its top-secret analysis. The Aryan nations made a promise or a vow in this United States. As of May the 1st, they would start turning this country into another Vietnam, burn it down, and make it a hellhole. And they are directly linked to the Nazis in South America. So what they say they would do and what these people say they want to do aren't a bit apart. Then the article goes on. The Odessa began as a network that helped tens of thousands of German war criminals escape to South America at the end of World War II. Now Odessa is back in business, masterminded from Brazil, a country notorious for harboring Nazi criminals, including Dr. Joseph Mengele. Sources say Odessa was reborn during a Hitler's birthday weekend attended by hundreds of aging Nazis and their younger recruits from 1978. Now, the important thing about this is that they weren't aging, and some of them were very young. They were working for Adolf Hitler very early, and they're not very, very old. They are hosting the reunion in the Brazilian village of Itatia, Itatiaia, in the Hotel Tyll, Tyll, a resort where the wall decorations are swastikas tipped with eagles' heads, screaming eagles' heads. It was then and there the Odessa regrouped and dedicated itself to mass destruction. Now, I don't think they dedicated themselves at that hotel or that birthday party. The reason they were able to have these annual birthday parties for Adolf Hitler was because they had planned all this very carefully after the war, and it was synchronized with keeping the Nazi party alive, the Hitler Youth, and so forth. So this wasn't thought up in Brazil. When the Vatican and the Red Cross and the Counterintelligence Corps of our United States, the OSS, were working with the Nazis and letting them leave Europe, it was for the purpose of rebuilding it, and those members of the Odessa, even openly identified, were incorporated into the United States intelligence system. I agree that there was this birthday party, and I agree that this is when they made their vows, maybe, but this wasn't where the idea got on for Adolf when he's 100, let's do this thing. That was planned going in 1943 when they couldn't win the war against the Soviet Union. The article goes on, the timing of the assault at this particular time gave the Odessa 12 years to recruit new fanatics, to plant bombs, to stockpile weapons, and choose targets. Do you think any bombs are a whole rash of airplanes that have gone down the last 2 weeks where everyone saw an explosion or indication of explosion, and no one can come to an answer anywhere across from England to Japan, the United States, Wisconsin, Dallas, Texas, Samantha Smith, all of these planes seem to have a bomb, just as the Korean airline with Larry McDonald seemed to have a bomb that blew it up, and this is what they said they would do. The article says, we know from our contacts these are not doddering war veterans. They are masters of German dedication organizations with millions in stolen gold bullion at their disposal and bankroll. Well, they not only had the millions, but they had diamonds and stocks and many, many millions, going almost into $1 billion of cash and gold that they could parlay into narcotics traffic and quadruple the money within each year practically with the scale of the narcotics traffic. This article concludes, they have never forgiven the United States for spearheading the 1945 downfall of the Third Reich and have indoctrinated recruits worldwide to their cause. Now, they may never have forgiven the United States, but that's not really true, because the top Nazis, except for a handful that were hung at Nuremberg as a token, were put together after the war. Hermann Abst, Otto Ambros, Abst working at the Vatican now, Hjalmar Schacht, who went right down to the floating ship of Aristotle Onassis, and Skorzeny coming into the United States intelligence and working in Madrid, and Hans Ulrich Rudel, the head of the Luftwaffe, weaving in and out of Germany and setting up his new recruits. And they were working with Allen Dulles, SS Karl Wolff, Heinrich Himmler, Adolf Hitler, the whole gang. They were mad that they couldn't take the Soviet Union, and they may have been mad that we didn't join them in fighting the Soviet Union. But the goal of Adolf Hitler was to take America long before they may be mad they lost the war, but they always planned to conquer us. That was part of Hitler's plans, and he said, if you take South America, then it's easy to take America. Take South America first. Now, the party they're talking about, I've referred to over and again. That's why this article is of particular interest, even though it came from this source. And I mentioned just a few weeks ago from the Documentation Center of Simon Wiesenthal how he wrote in 1981 about Gustav Franz Wagner, W-A-G-N-E-R. Now, it was at Wagner's party, he was allegedly with Hitler at that party in 1978, and that's what caused Wagner to hide, and Romeo Tuma, the chief of police, the defense police in Sao Paulo, refused to extradite him. Simon Wiesenthal had said in his newsletter, and I just cited this 3 weeks ago, that after a search of more than 10 years, Gustav Franz Wagner was discovered in 1978 by the Documentation Center in Brazil and arrested by the local police. He was discovered when newspaper people took their pictures at the party for Adolf Hitler, threw his hands over his face, went to the police, and this is the same Romeo Tuma, the police chief, who would not extradite Wagner to 4 countries that wanted him. And yet, Simon Wiesenthal said, one day after the bones were dug up of Joseph Mengele, I'm more convinced it was him. Before there was a shred of evidence, he went with the very police chief who had kept Wagner in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And Wiesenthal writes about how he managed to get governments from 4 different countries to ask for his extraditions. this is the documentation center of Simon Wiesenthal. Well, you may ask 4 countries to send Wagner home. He ran the concentration camp at Treblinka, where allegedly hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed, and he also worked at Sobibor. There were 2 concentration camps he worked at, and he may have pressed the countries, bring him back. But what happened was, in Brazil, they changed the papers of the day he got in Brazil, and the 1947 date that he got in there, that he was supposed to have arrived there, was changed to 1974, and this let Wagner get free. So the papers were forged in Brazil. Wiesenthal says, I found him. He didn't find him. He couldn't get him back to trial, and yet he works with the same policeman. And then he said Wagner commits suicide by stabbing himself with a knife October the 4th, 1980. So the case is closed. Well, Wiesenthal closes cases easily. We don't know if Wagner cut his throat. I'll bet you Simon Wiesenthal wasn't down there to see the body or fingerprint the body, but this is the story of the 1978 experience in Brazil, and it's interesting that this was written up as a birthday party for Hitler, because that's what I was told by people who were in Brazil at the time, saw the headlines, and said it was common knowledge that they were all down there, including Adolf, and I'll update more of that. I've talked about that from time to time. Now, the San Francisco Chronicle and our Monterey Herald this morning had a story, September the 9th, 1985, 11 neo-Nazis go on trial. The neos are the ones that didn't fight in World War II, but they have joined to South America and to Germany, the same Nazis that want to take America over. And the gist of the article was 11 neo-Nazis who allegedly went on a year-long orgy of robbery, counterfeiting, arson, and killing, including the Denver talk show host Alan Berg, go on trial in the U.S. District Court today. They're charged, among other things, with a pattern of racketeering, a plan to overthrow the United States government, and to rid America of blacks and Jews. Now, I don't know what the crime is for overthrowing the United States government, but this morning's news, when I wake up, I usually turn on 1 or 2 of the different stations, flick it around, and I believe it was CBS has been advertising a series they're having this week, one each day, on the talk show hosts and their personalities, and Dick Cavett, and they had Phil Donahue and so forth. And the promo, the person talking about the show was asking several of the others, why do talk show hosts burn out? People like Alan Berg. Now imagine CBS in 1985, the same day that the men who killed Alan Berg are going on trial, they're saying he burned out. He was gunned down with about 22 bullets in his garage when he got home from the radio station. And they call that a burnout, like he wasn't popular anymore or the show ran out of steam. The man was gunned down by the Aryan nations, and the major networks continue these lies and brainwashing, not making any connection that a talk show host was gunned down. And part of the prominence of Berg to make him look crazy was that segment on 60 Minutes where they showed him looking really mentally sick, and I'm sure he had much more talent than that, was much more political than that, and they made him look so silly that when he died, he looked crazy, responsible for his own death. And while men are being charged for his murder, our major network, they're trying to tell you he burned out. Now, this was part of a plan to overthrow America. Another article on this trial refers to the men who are in the organization known as the Order. Now, that is an international group. That isn't just a group in Seattle. The Order have done these bank robberies. They've done 2 murders they're being charged with, and they haven't yet decided who of the gang killed Alan Berg. The gun that killed him was found in the home of Gary Lee Yarborough, but they haven't yet decided which of the whole group killed him, but they know that among them there were people who killed them. And they said they may be sent to prison for up to 40 years. That means 3 months to 40 years for trying to overthrow America and kill every Jew and black in America. This past weekend, there was a Brinks heist in Providence, Rhode Island. The Aryan Nation, the Order, can make $1 million a month. All they have to do is keep robbing banks, and as they said in the newspaper accounts, this was an inside job, and many of the Brinks officials have worked their way up there and are members of the Aryan nations of the order, and that is the way they keep themselves going. Now, several weeks ago, I cited an article. This one is from the Monterey Herald. FBI official says Klan influence is waning. And again, these are the people coming up to face this trial, the group from the Aryan nations, the Posse Comitatus, the Order, the Covenant of the Sword, the Arm of the Lord. They are, as the FBI says, highly trained, willing to die, and they are taking over from the Klan and what they call the right-wing terrorists, the ragtag group that weren't so cohesive. Now they have computers, they're very cohesive, and they are the Klan, and they are the Nazi, and they are the Order, and they're all one. And to pass them off as being a little more than the Klan, that now we have them, is putting lightly that they are the same and had the same goals and as the Nazi Party and the Klan, but they're more sophisticated now. Now, the Los Angeles Times had a story not too long ago, it was August the 11th, titled Neo-Nazis Enact a Not-So-Comic Opera. It's a dumb title written by Paul Montgomery, but it comes from Brussels in Europe, and it's a very important article, and it's part one of a series I want to do for you, but not all in one evening. So connect what I'm going to do now, and we'll refer to it later in the future. The article was written in Brussels, and this is what it's about. The author describes one Sunday afternoon in Belgium, not long ago, where members of the Nazi groups of Western Europe have their annual conclave. Several hundred people were wearing military gear, black hiking shorts, thick black boots, scarves and insignia, and shoulder patches from West Germany, Holland, Belgium, and Sweden to identify themselves. West Germany, Italy, Holland, Belgium, and Sweden. Some cut their hair to the scalps, like the motorcycle gang. Some are uniformed parents. Some have children dressed in uniforms. They have literature tables that you help yourself to read, and they're reprinted in half a dozen languages. The Friends of South Africa is one group. The Order of the Eternal Return is another. The Young National Democrats is another. The Mystery of the Dunes is another. The Anti-Immigrant Coalition, the Eastern Europeans and so forth, the Anti-Russian, the Immigrants, Anti-Immigrant Coalition is another. One of the books they sell there for them to read is titled, Is Hitler Really Dead? I haven't read the book. I don't know if it's a figure of speech, but people that live in Brazil and Argentina who are familiar with the country and the terrain, and I've talked to people from both countries who were there in the 50s and 60s, and they discussed the fact that he was alive. But if it's just in spirit, you can choose what you want to believe. I happen to believe he wasn't dead. They also have books called Jewish Crimes Through the Centuries. They display their clubs, their chains, their knives, their bayonets. And at the last convention, the police arrested 49 men out of the group, probably took them away like the three tramps at Dealey Plaza, were arrested in Dallas, and then there was no name or record, and as soon as they're carted away, they're released. Goodness knows what they do with them. One of the groups is the National Front of Great Britain. Those are the men that were involved with the soccer team and the murders that took place in Belgium. The National Front of Great Britain, and half of the people arrested among this group in Belgium were from that group. The chairman of the Liverpool Soccer Club and the National Front supporters were kept out of this meeting this year, even though they're active as part of the organization, because they had caused 38 deaths in Belgium at the soccer game. The game that Henry Kissinger attended as a member of the National Soccer Board with Mr. Agnelli from Italy. The article continues, many members or former members of the neo-Nazi groups represented at the various recent meetings are implicated in murders, in bombings, in bank robberies, in arms trafficking, in dope running, and in other crimes. You have a wide range here. We're talking about people from West Germany, Italy, Holland, Belgium, and Sweden, and there are a lot of Nazis in France. They haven't mentioned them in this article from Brussels, but Mr. Le Pen, the candidate to replace Mr. Mitterrand, is a known Nazi, and there are quite a lot of Nazis in France. But these people who attend these conferences, no policemen round them up, I suppose, implicated. That doesn't mean they were ever charged with a crime. Just implicated in murders, bombings, bank robberies, arms trafficking, dope running, and other crimes. Some appear at these conferences in their SS uniforms, and this was happening down in South America with Klaus Barbie and Stefano Delle Chiaie and members of a drug enforcement agency attending meetings with men wearing the costumes, not costumes, the real suits of the Waffen-SS. Now the article goes on, terrorism since the 1980 Bologna bombing train station that killed 81. Some of these people were involved in that kind of terrorism. And I've cited their names before, and I'll go back to the names later in the Bologna bombing. Only 81 were killed there. Then there was a bomb at the Munich Oktoberfest. That was where 13 were killed, and some of those members attend these conferences that are part of the bombings. The most virulent neo-Nazi groups are very small, and they appear fragmented. That's like Larry Schmidt writing to Volkmar Schmidt in Germany, who then comes home to work for Edwin Walker in Dallas, and to Bernard Weissman and the people in Munich, Germany that worked with our Defense Department over in Germany in army bases. They said, just give us a handful of men, 7 or 8, and we could control the world. If we could kill a handful of men, we could control the world. So this Paul Montgomery writes that these are small groups, and that the largest group of all of them, of the various groups meeting there, is called the Paramilitary Sporting Group, the SPG, and that's what I'll get on to next week to continue the links of this group to Dallas, Texas, to General Walker and Robert Morris and William Buckley, and our cult of death in the United States, that is the Odessa, along with them, and those are pretty strong words to use. The most virulent of the Nazi groups is small. It seems small, but the largest of those groups is called the SPG, the Paramilitary Sporting Group. The head of it is Heinze Hoffman, Karlheinz Hoffman, which has 400 adherents, broken up by West German police in 1980. Hoffman was linked to the Oktoberfest, and he's in jail, and I'll give the charges for that next week, and I've mentioned it before. He was linked to the Bologna bombing and to Klaus Barbie and to our CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Hoffman's group as such, he was removed because he was linked to the killings, but the SPG, the Sporting Group Paramilitary, or Sporting Paramilitary Group, the way the words are reversed in Europe and South America, the membership of 20 or less among most of the Nazi organizations is common. But then the point is that they have computers that connect them so that they're not isolated. They have all these different names. If you would like, I'd spend 1 week on the air just reading the titles of right-wing organizations that were formed by 1979, and they have to have tripled or quadrupled by now. Now, Paul Montgomery continues in this article on the neo-Nazis. He says the most extreme right-wing, probably the most extreme, is in Belgium, where 2 years ago a former paratrooper was arrested in Brussels. No relationship. Brussels, Belgium, you don't hear that too much as being involved in a Nazi system or headquarters, but Brussels, Belgium is one of those places. And this person who was arrested, this paratrooper, had shot his brother. He was angry, and he shot his brother in a rage. And they went to his room, and they found a cache of arms in the room of the assassin, and a stack of top-secret North Atlantic Treaty Organization documents from NATO. And he said that he was part of a group called the WESTLAND New Post, previously unknown. All this came about because he had shot his brother, and they went there. Now, Westland New Post, Westland New Post, was founded, according to this article, to defend the cultural and genetic patrimony of the white race, the genetic patrimony of the white race against North Africans, Turks, Slavs, South Americans, and leftists. Genetic purity of getting rid of leftists of any color. The trial led to Paul Latinus, Latinus, a 38-year-old nuclear engineer who was a member of various political jobs. He held political groups in the Belgian government. He was a member of the government. He was arrested in 1978 for illegal arms possession. But when he was arrested, you see, this one man shot his brother. They went into the home of the man who shot him, found the NATO papers. The NATO papers led to the genocidal plans and genetic experimentation to get rid of anything but the pure, led to Paul Latinus, a man working for the Belgian government. He was a member of the far-right youth group, and he was infiltrating the environmentalist groups, and he attended paramilitary training camps in South Africa, what was Rhodesia. And WESTLAND New Post was founded in 1980 as an information-gathering organization with a secret police section modeled after the Gestapo and called the Bureau for Zionist Affairs. We'll take a 1-minute break. I'll go back to Paul Latinos and NATO. Alexander Haig was head of NATO during this time period, and then we'll go on to some other interconnecting links of the Odessa that this original article was just mentioning it, but I keep updating it all of the time. This is Mae Brussell, the second half of a 1-hour program called World Watchers. I'll now continue. I'm citing an article from the Los Angeles Times written by Paul Montgomery called Neo-Nazis Enact a Not-So-Common Comic Opera, August 11th, 1985. Just to conclude this information about Paul Latinus, remember that Mr. Pierce, who heads the Aryan Nations, the national Nazi party that was taken over after George Rockwell was murdered, he had a PhD, and worked for the U.S. Air Force on a contract, a $38,000 contract, then went to United Technology in Connecticut, the Pratt Whitney, and had a large amount of money for them, and then went to Washington, D.C. This is the man who wrote the Turner Diaries on how to kill all the Jews in the United States and how to kill the blacks, to get rid of all of them, and then went to Washington, D.C. to take over the Nazi Party, just give it a sanitized name, and connect it to the very groups that we're talking about that link directly to these people. So Paul Latinus, being a nuclear engineer, isn't any different than Mr. William Pierce, who has a PhD from Colorado and taught at the university in Oregon and works for the Defense Department and the Air Force and United Technology. Incidentally, the bulk of the airplane crashes that they're trying to analyze on why they blew up or went down and crashed, the engines were made by Pratt Whitney and United Technology, and Alexander Haig was not only the head of NATO, but he was the president of Pratt Whitney United Technology It's the same firm. So when you read about these engines cracking and the planes going down, or maybe they were meant like our refrigerators and TVs and cars to have an expectancy so that by a certain year they're all falling into the ocean. They're examining them in Great Britain. They are the company, the one that Alexander Haig of the Defense Intelligence Agency, working with the Vatican, a Knight of Malta. Haig is still very much related to United Technology, and those are the planes that are going down at this time, and they're promising problems with planes. All coincidental, you understand, but I thought I should just tell you some of the coincidences, because when they have papers from NATO, and Haig was part of NATO, and I've accused them of being behind so many or all of the coups that have taken place and the dictatorships that have come to power. So Paul Latinus is working for the Belgian government, and we have people working for our government that are committing the same kind of treason that these people want, which is in fact the destruction of America. So the group is called the WESTLAND New Post, to defend cultural genetic patrimony of the white race against, and I gave you the list. Now, the members of this group, called the Bureau for Zionist Affairs, they have several dozen members, and they have a code room. They worked in the Belgian General Staff, and they have stolen copies of NATO messages to the Belgian Army and a decoding grid for NATO known as COSMIN, COMSIM, capital letters. WESTLAND New Post would sell the messages from NATO and the codes to clients, including a Saudi Arabian newspaper. The Westland Post also received training from a member of the BEGAUB Security Services, BEGAUB Security Services, and among the targets that they were suspected of killing were several Soviet spies. 1 month after a practice session with these people, a couple was found dead, and the ex-paratrooper said that he had taken part in their murders. This story began with a former paratrooper arrested in Brussels who had shot his brother, and his room was filled with papers from NATO. He was part of the organization WESTLAND New Post, which is a continuation of the policies of Adolf Hitler, and they wear the uniforms of the Waffen-SS. They're part of the Belgian government, the security services. They can murder people and still be out running their conventions. He said he took part in that murder. The man who said, this Paul Latinus, who was giving the information about Westland New Post, where the trail led to him and the Belgian government, was found hanged. At first they said it was a suicide. Later the case was reopened, and they said, the article concludes by saying, this case is like turning over a rock. Insects were crawling in every direction. Well, you bet they were, and they're still crawling, but now they're sort of out in the open, and there aren't so many rocks to push around because they're becoming more visible, and they have their conventions, and nothing seems to happen. Now, the importance of those groups, I've charted out just a very simple chart that can be understood in terms of names I've used before but are new to some people, and I don't expect you to remember these names, but I'll just run off a few connections between that article, the article that preceded it, and what I'll be working on next week to show you the tie-ins. This Heinze Hoffman that's referred to in this article as being one of the known terrorist groups, the largest group, worked directly with, and they're both still alive, Stefano Delle Chiaie. Stefano Delle Chiaie has worked with Edwin Walker of the John Birch Society, a member of the John Birch Society, and Hoffman is a co-worker in the P2 organization, the Masonic Lodge in Italy, that tried to put the Neo or the Nazi government back in power, the scandal that broke open in May of 81. Hoffman works with a Mr. Feeblecorn and a Mr. Danet, D-A-N-E-T, and Mr. Feeblecorn, and I'll do more about them next week. Now, Hoffman, Feeblecorn, and Danet all linked down to Bolivia, to Klaus Barbie, all worked there with Klaus Barbie in Bolivia. And Klaus Barbie, of course, was the man under the tutelage of Henry Kissinger, when Kissinger was in counterintelligence corps, when Barbie was allowed to get his way out of Europe with Licio Gelli, a member of the Waffen-SS, who created the rat line to get them out. Our counterintelligence corps, the Vatican, the Waffen-SS, all working together long before the war was over, but the decisions had been made, and now the train was rolling down to where they took the boats to South America. And Kissinger also is in charge of Otto Skorzeny, the chief of the Odessa, the article cited when I began this program. Now, Feeblecorn worked with the death squads in Bolivia, and he worked with the people who blew up in the tunnel, the train in Bologna. He was an agent of the United States at the Drug Enforcement Agency. As soon as he was arrested, the Drug Enforcement Agency handed him over to German intelligence and drug agencies because they sort of washed their hands of the scandal, and Barbie and Skorzeny and Feeblecorn all worked for the United States. Now, Heinze Hoffman was funded for his most violent and the largest radical organization in Europe by Gerhard Frey, F-R-E-I, from Munich, Germany. Gerhard Frey was on the telephone with Edwin Walker the day after John Kennedy was murdered. I wrote in my article in Rebel, November 22nd, 1983, the relationship of General Walker, Gerhard Frey, trying to create a communist story out of Lee Harvey Oswald being the patsy for shooting Kennedy. And last week on World Watchers, I cited Isaac Don Levine, working with Marina Oswald, working with Mr. Krebs of the Odessa in 1939-1940 to make people pro-Hitler and anti-communist, working with Marina Oswald and John J. McCloy and Alan Dulles to make a commie story out of the murder of John Kennedy. And Gerhard Frey and Edwin Walker, of course, are closely associated through the organizations in Texas that became the nucleus of Young Americans for Freedom with Robert Morris, a Knight of the Vatican, similar to William Casey, and Alexander Haig and William Buckley, who formed the Knights of Malta, and YAF is the home base of Richard Vagary, with his close links to people like Jesse Helms and Mr. D'Aubuisson and all the right-wing organizations. Now, I have not discussed, and I will detail in a few weeks, a group called the AVG Group by H.L. Hunt. That was the death squad in America, set up by H.L. Hunt, the John Birch Society, and General Walker. And their relationships then go to James Angleton, another Knight of Malta from the Vatican, working with Mr. Borghetti, and Oscar Skorzeny, and the connections of these people in Germany, the old Germans, the old Gestapo, with the new Germans, with the new death squads, and wearing the SS uniforms now, recycles itself right into Dallas, Texas, and all of these people, through mountains of files and connections, are linked to the murders of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. So when that little article in that Star said that they will achieve their goal by assassinations, I'm citing some of the interconnecting links to just 3 assassinations that changed the whole tone of America, the 2 Kennedys and Martin Luther King. And I'll do more on these charts because I don't expect you to remember those names at all, and I'll make them available for you, just as I've done with many of these other broadcasts, and they accompany the broadcast, and then you can see them and study them as long as you want. Now, there's a new book coming out that Tom Davis told me about. He supplies the researchers and generously looks all over this state for books that are of interest to us. He told me about a new book called Hands of Death, and it's described as the startling facts of Henry Lee Lucas. It will be out soon, and Tom will have it. It's from Prescott Press in Lafayette, Louisiana, and there's going to be a national author tour and radio and TV appearances, including Henry Lee Lucas, direct from his prison cell in Texas. Superstar Lewis is going to promote his book. Now here's the startling facts of Henry Lee Lucas. Self-confessed murderer of over 360 people. The man who supplied poison to Jim Jones in Guyana. The man who stalked former President Jimmy Carter for over 1 year. Among the most infamous killers in history. Now, when Lucas had talked about all these murders, they flew him to California about a year ago, and they allowed him to go to 4 grave sites, and 4 to 6, I don't remember the number, but I do have the news accounts in my files of deaths that you can hardly keep up with, and then they flew him back to Texas. Now, there's a lot of people who don't know where members of their family are, whether they were kidnapped, whether they're alive or dead, and it would be very nice if he could have a month and go throughout California and show where these people are buried. But it is my contention that these serial killers are part of the Machiavellian plans for exactly what they're doing, and that out of every 6 people they kill, 2 are political reasons that they're killing them for, and the other 4 can be random, so that it doesn't appear that there's any sense and that you're purposely killing authors and labor leaders and civil rights leaders and so forth. You take out what you want and a few to boot, and so that they can do what they do best, which is a whole series of murders, and he's going to be interviewed. Now, Texas was talking about giving him the death penalty. It seems to me that they should use Lucas to go around and, instead of killing him, identify, yes, these people were killed, and at least put their minds to rest. Now, when they were talking about the Carter attempted murder of Carter, I got out a few articles on the assassination plans, not all of them when Carter was president, but a few interesting ones. One is August the 4th, 1976, as soon as Carter was president, and the article is titled, Rufus Youngblood, ex-agent who shielded Johnson, joins the Carter staff. And it says, ex-Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood shielded Johnson in the Dallas motorcade in which Kennedy was killed. He's joined the staff of Jimmy Carter, and formerly he was going to retire from the Secret Service, and after Carter's administration, he did retire in Savannah, Georgia, and then he joined Democratic presidential nominees' advance teams to handle the logistics in the Atlanta campaign office. Now, Atlanta, Georgia, is where Larry McDonald and Murder Incorporated came from, where there were direct links to the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, and Rufus Youngblood is retired in Atlanta, Georgia. I don't know whether I heard that he passed away recently. I'm not sure, but this is where he was to spend the rest of his days. Now, when John Kennedy was killed at Dealey Plaza, Rufus Youngblood, many of you don't remember, were too young to know or forgot or didn't know at all, was the person who not only shielded Lyndon Johnson, but he had pillows in the car. Doesn't every vice president run with pillows, as if that would save you? But he threw these pillows around LBJ, and the car was directly behind John Kennedy, and he jumped on his body to protect him. And there's pictures of him showing, going around the corner of the Texas School Book Depository in front of there. And just before John Kennedy was shot, or just while he's being shot, Youngblood has the car parked and the door is open, and the motorcade was moving around the corner. They hadn't sped up all, they weren't speeding up. The driver didn't know Kennedy was shot, or he hadn't yet been shot, and the door, Lyndon Johnson's car stopped directly in front of the Texas School Book Depository, and the door was open, and that was Youngblood. He had the pillows, he sat on Johnson, and he opened the door. Now, I got out some of the stories, as I say, about Jimmy Carter. One of them is from Newsweek, May 21st, 1979. Was there a plot to kill Carter? Well, do you realize that that's practically the only time that we've had a political assassination in this country that they suggested a plot? Not the loner, not the grin. If Carter had been killed, there would have been a man grinning, a loner, and there would have been a diary in the hotel room. But because they caught these people before he was shot, they caught the whole team. Otherwise, again, we would have had someone like Mark David Chapman, who killed John Lennon, and Artie Bremer, or Sirhan with his diary, and Patsy Lee Harvey Oswald with their diary. But they actually called it in Newsweek a plot, and another article referred to it as a plot. The Los Angeles Times had a story, man charged with plot to kill the president, and it tells about a man who had a starter pistol, a very innocent thing, and they picked him up. But the interesting thing, and many of you might remember, I did broadcast on this quite a long time ago, in May of 71, that was 4 years ago, tape number 388, if you want to look it up. Remember the man who was arrested in Los Angeles? His name was Raymond Lee Harvey. It was Lee Harvey Oswald, so this was Raymond Lee Harvey, and he was held under $50,000 bail, and he was working with another man named Oswaldo Ortiz Espinozo. So you had this Lee Harvey, Lee Harvey as one of them, and Oswaldo as the other, and they both came from Mexico and lived at a hotel right across the street where the president would come, just as Lee Harvey Oswald happened to be working in a Texas School Book Depository, where out of all of Texas, the motorcade would come right in front of them. These four men had come from Mexico. They didn't know where they came from or didn't have any background upon them, but they showed they had escaped from a mental hospital. They had criminal records and had been in mental hospitals and had a suspicion of a lot of burglaries, but could have had a lot of mind job. If the President Carter had been killed, they may have been the victim, and still are, of a lot of mind control. But it turned out that the pistol that was to be trained in MacArthur Park in Los Angeles to see how loud it was to be the diversionary. And if Lee Harvey Oswald were a diversionary, and actually that Italian Carcano, he didn't shoot or hold or touch, there's no sign or link of him to that gun, but somebody was a diversionary. Then the crossfire came, and the crossfire could be the silencers. And what they were playing was three people to do the shooting and one a diversionary. So it's exactly like the John Kennedy assassination script. Not exactly, but there's a lot of crossovers or seem to overlap in the techniques that would happen if they wanted to kill Jimmy Carter. Another story, May the 11th, 1979, in the San Francisco Examiner, evidence now indicates a four-man plot. Again, the word plot. And it says the Secret Service didn't take this seriously. They weren't going to do anything. They thought the man was just drunk and he had a funny gun that didn't shoot anything. And at the time they said, we didn't believe the story. But he admitted to have been drinking, but the story began to hold together that there was more information. And as it opened up, he was linked to these other men at the hotel. And it turned out that there was more than one person, and they put them in. I don't know whatever happened to these people. It says Espinosa Ortiz agreed with Lee Harvey, that they knew two Mexicans at one hotel who had rifles. Harvey told the agents he was told of the plot by three others in a room at the hotel, and he understood they would fire the fatal shot, and he would be the diversion with the starter pistol. So, so much for that. The one of the men has a bunch of aliases. He'd been in the United States for 20 months, but they don't bother to explain why four Mexicans would want to kill Jimmy Carter. And then there was another long article in the Globe showing a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald and John Kennedy, titled, "Was There a Plot to Kill Carter in This Hotel?" calling attention to Lee Harvey, and the other one's named Oswaldo. You couldn't help but notice it. And that was one plan to try and kill the president. There were three men from Mexico. But Mr. Lucas says, and he was basically from Texas, although the Kennedy assassination involved highly trained assassins from Oaxaca, Mexico, who were brought in by Division 5 of the FBI. November the 7th, 1976, there was a story, Texan charged for Carter threat. And this is about a man on $25,000 bond by the name of Thomas Gargan, who is from Texas, and, of course, Lucas's home base is Texas. Then there was another interesting story about Texas, two other death plots planned from Texas. One was from El Paso, Texas. A federal warrant was issued for an accused Texas man. Secret Service agent said he paid $10,000, having to be counterfeit money to have Carter assassinated. Now, these were hired assassins, so Lucas may not have been out doing them all. He may have been looking in the crowd and stalking. But William Rodney Etheridge, 25, of Odessa, Texas, was arrested, and he was in custody on various charges, and he was held for questioning. Another fugitive from justice wanted in Utah, and he was involved with the assassination, again called a death plot, but a different one than the other, referring to plots in America. You don't realize that they ever use those words, but they do. Another story about Texas involves a suspect in Carter death threat. This was July 16th, 1980, San Jose Mercury, a man named Majed Khamis, Khamis. A 21-year-old man was sought by the Secret Service for threatening to kill President Carter and Senator Edward Kennedy. He was taken into custody in San Francisco. He's a student. He didn't give out any information of himself. Witnesses saw him, according to the Secret Service, making threats in Dallas, Texas, and reported it to the federal officials. He'd gone on to San Francisco, and then they set the bill for $1 million, and he was sent back to Texas, and his home base is Irving, Texas. Of course, that's where Lee and Marina Oswald were. Lee rented a room in Irving, Texas, and they went to his room, and there was a search warrant in Irving, Texas, where they found a variety of weapons and PLO propaganda. Weapons seized two 3.357 caliber revolvers, a deer rifle, a shotgun, and two devastated hand grenades. Now, William Sullivan of the FBI, of Division 5 of the FBI, was shot as being a moose or a deer up in New England at the time the House Select Committee was investigating assassinations. This fellow just coincidentally had a deer rifle. But the reason I mentioned Sullivan is that after they went into his apartment, he shared with four other people who were Jordanian nationals. Khamis told the Secret Service that he was captain in the PLO and had committed 100 murders, including the slayings in Irving, Texas, of two Lebanese students aged 18 and 20 who caused trouble for the PLO. Now, getting back to Atlanta, Georgia, and Larry McDonald and Murder Incorporated, I wrote about their relationship in the Hustler article on the Korean airline, and Larry McDonald, the organization known as Murder Incorporated, with the links of killing politicians, the goal of the Odessa, and people for political purposes. And I talked about Mr. George Habash in Lebanon and the PLO organization. It was Mark David Chapman who went to Lebanon for 6 months before he came back, and then went to Hawaii, and then took some trips and ended up in front of the Dakota Hotel when John Lennon was murdered. So just to say your PLO doesn't mean anything. But he said he did 100 assassinations already for political purposes, and Mr. Lucas was behind 360. So was Mr. Camis working with Lucas, or could they shoot for the government to protect the assassins? People like William Sullivan, just with the deer rifles, he was mistaken for one of those deers and just offed instead of being able to testify or to cover up or to perjure or whatever before the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigating John Kennedy's murder and Martin Luther King's murder. So Camis showed the Secret Service a poster of Jimmy Carter with a bullseye drawn on the face. He practiced throwing knives at the poster. I've never heard about these people. I don't know where their trials are. He had $1,000 cash. So he comes from Dallas and Irving, Texas. He's in San Francisco, $1 million bail. Then they just fade away in the landscape. That's how they can do 100 murders or 360 murders. Lucas is sitting in jail. He's done his quota. But Camis may have a few more to go. I didn't ever read that he went to jail or was deported or anything like that. So when Lucas brags about all the murders and having a part in stalking Jimmy Carter, I just pulled out related just a few assassination attempts, the ones from Mexico, the one from Waco, Texas, the one from Odessa, Texas, and Irving, Texas, and Mr. Camis from Dallas, Texas, and show the locale of these people and how the nucleus for death plots goes out from the United States just like it does from Germany and Brussels in Belgium and all the other countries in Europe that are developing the Nazi organizations already well set up in South America, that we do in fact have these death squads in this country. Now, speaking of death squads, and for the remaining time, I don't have too much time left to get into it, I've talked about Simon Wiesenthal covering up the Colonia Dignidad, where all the Nazis trained, and Jack Anderson, I often cite his articles, one in 1979, August the 3rd, about the Nazi war criminals from Germany training in South America at Colonia Dignidad, and their role in the execution of Chilean exile leader Orlando Letelier, and their role in killing Mr. Allende and putting dictator Pinochet into power. Jack Anderson is wonderful at talking about these members of the Luftwaffe and the Nazis. And I've cited many times on the air the connections of George Bush as CIA director to the murder of Orlando Letelier and to Colonia Dignidad and to Murder Incorporated, the very Odessa. This is the man who's sitting as Vice President of the United States with those direct links to the Odessa organizations and the Nazi killers, and he's a part of those. Another example of their death squad activity was the murder of Terry Santana. I don't remember if I talked about her, but at the time she was murdered, she was helping two writers, Don Dingus and Saul Landau, write a book on the murder of Orlando Letelier that was called Assassination on Embassy Row. This woman was a good investigative reporter. She was a political activist. In December of 1982, rags were found in her apartment, the 5th floor upstairs, with gasoline and flammable fluid, and this poor woman was burned to death on the 5th floor of an apartment, and the New York City police said it was probably a suicide, even though there were suspicious circumstances, and she was helping expose the very murder that George Bush was director of the CIA when it was happening. The Guardian in New York had an article about her December the 16th, 1982. The National Catholic Reporter had an article about her, a commentary on her work and her political activism, and they said, among other things, the suspicions were centered on the existence of rags soaked with inflammable fluids in the apartment and the involvement in looking into her murder of the joint FBI New York City Terrorist Task Force. They were formed to probe political activists, radical groups, third world groups, and the New York Medical Examiner said she died of inhalation of smoke, even though there were these rags around there that indicated that somebody had set the fire. At the time she was killed, she was helping investigate the right-wing anti-terrorist Cubans, not the anti-terrorists, the terrorist Cubans, the anti-Castro Cubans, the death squads that were formed by the CIA and Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson, and George Bush was CIA director over those men. She was investigating, and she was an expert on those particular people, known for her work in studying the police state in El Salvador, the death squads in El Salvador. So she was burned. This was 1982, and the police wanted to cover it up as if she would put gasoline on a rag and burn herself, even though she was with people practically up till the evening of her death, and there was no indication she was suicidal. She was working with the Marino Films Project, and there were the nuns that were killed in El Salvador, and she was trying to help them. I wanted to just read you a couple of pages called The New Order, which is the group. They are the group up in Seattle. They're the group in South America, from a book called The Nazi Legacy, Klaus Barbie and the Fascist Connections. It's written by Neil Asherson and Mr. Linklater and Isabel Hilton. I'll do it next week because it goes into the fiancés of death, the death squads, the people our government they're working with, the murder of Orlando Letelier, and the crux of George Bush, Letelier, the South American Nazis, and the German Nazis that I just cited that article about, because Stefano Delle Chiaie is one of the main contacts. He's still alive. He's in Peru now, and he's causing the Maoists to have a lot of violence whereby a dictatorship could be put into power and they can kill federal agents, and then the federal agents retaliate against the terrorists. Stefano Delle Chiaie has infiltrated himself among the native population in Peru, and all that can end with that is death squads, and military dictatorships that he's very good putting together. In this book on Klaus Barbie and the New Order, it tells about Chiaie's contacts into Spain, working with Lopez Rega of the Argentina's 3 deaths, the AA death squads, his work with the DINA police, working with Michael Townley and helping with the murder of Orlando Letelier, the former ambassador of Allende of Chile. And then these people, as I say, go back to the Nazi connections in Italy and in France and in Belgium and Germany, and the British Nazis directly linked back to the United States, the Aryan nations, and the Order, whose trial, that group, 11 are on trial now. 11 have pleaded guilty, and 1 is on the lam. The one on the lam is probably the Drug Enforcement Agency of the CIA. But I'll have to get back to this next week. Enough of that unpleasant subject for 1 week. We'll put it away, and I'll be continuing along these lines next week. This is Mae Brussell, and you take care, and keep reading those newspapers right along with me. Bye-bye.